how did air conditioning become part of the culture wars? When you walk anywhere in the United States in the heat of the summer, pretty much any shop or building is chilly, freezing even. In the United States, air conditioning has become expected, not just in shops or workplaces, but also in homes. Nearly 90% of US homes have AC. But it's far less common in Europe, which has been experiencing record-breaking temperatures this summer, especially in France, where the question over whether to have air conditioning or not have air conditioning has sparked a pretty fierce political debate, which has reached boiling point. From the BBC, I'm Tristan Redman in London, and this is The Global Story on YouTube.
So a bit later in the podcast, we're going to be speaking to one of the hosts of the BBC's Climate Question podcast. But before that, we're zooming in on France with a guest that you probably know pretty well by now, Tristan Redman, host of The Global Story.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me on your show, Sumi.
Well, actually, it's your show, but I'm happy to talk to you about what an interesting topic, isn't it? Air conditioning. It might seem innocuous, Tristan, but I think you and I know it is anything but.
It is anything but.
I can tell you on this side of the Atlantic, there has been so much media coverage of late, not just about the heat wave in the US, but about air conditioning and the lack thereof in Europe. And there are a lot of strong feelings.
There are strong feelings on all sides, probably. Right?
I want to give you just a taste of the headlines in some of the main publications here.
Okay.
There was an editorial in the Washington Post that claimed that European hostility towards air conditioning is suicidal. A Wall Street Journal editorial called Alternative Cooling Solutions Green Virtue Signaling. New York Magazine called the debate in Europe bewildering. There's been a lot of focus on the picture in France. And
yes.
Tristan, you live in Paris, so paint this picture
I do.
for us then. What is it like to live in Paris during a heat wave?
Well, it can be a nightmare. It doesn't cool down really very much at night because there's a lot of stone, a lot of heavy stone buildings, and they just radiate heat at night. And people get used to this feeling. You sleep with your windows open because you most likely don't have air conditioning. And the feeling of being in Paris in the summer is the feeling of listening and hearing all of your neighbors and all the things that they're doing as you try to go to sleep. So sometimes they're cooking, sometimes they're arguing, sometimes they're snoring. A lot of the time they're having sex.
Find it charming.
Yeah, well, yes and no. Sometimes it's charming for a very short period of time and then it gets a bit much. I would say that the conversation that happens inside my family is something like a microcosm of the conversation about air conditioning, maybe all the way across Europe. So just to give you an example of like me and my wife. So a couple of years ago, we invested in a very shoddy little air conditioning unit. Now, in the United States, you laugh at it. It's barely big enough to cool one room. But we put it in our bedroom, and then on really hot nights, my daughters, two of them, will come in and sleep in the room with us. So there are four of us huddling in one room. But the difference between my wife and I comes from the fact that I grew up in the United States, so I'm quite attached to air conditioning as a concept. So I will sneak down the corridor like maybe 2 or 3 hours before we're going to go to bed, and I'll turn on the air conditioning and I'll close the door in the bedroom because I want the room to be cool when we come to bed. And if my wife gleans that I have done this, she will tend to then sneak down the corridor and then turn it off again because she thinks I'm being irresponsible. And she'll look at me and she will think that I am some sort of profligate wastrel. And I will look at her and think that she is preaching at me. And those are the divisions that exist. And that you can extrapolate throughout European society in some ways.
Yeah, so why has the debate, do you think, been so loud this year?
Well, I think the reason ultimately is change. Europe is changing. Climate change is a real thing. As a continent, temperatures are creeping up faster than any other continent on Earth. Historically, you haven't needed air conditioning in Europe. So as recently as 20 years ago, when I lived in Paris, there would be, maybe 5 or 6 nights a year where it was unbearably hot, so it wasn't really worth getting air conditioning. Now it can be weeks and weeks at a stretch. Let me run you through, Sumi, some of the things that have happened this spring and summer, because it started in spring. So the first heat wave was in May, which is very early. There was a second 11-day heat wave in June. A lot of schools and hospitals, Sumi, are not air conditioned. Thousands of schools have had to close. Thousands more had to adjust their schedules. At the beginning of July, the French National Public Health Agency said that it recorded an increase of more than 2,000 deaths during the last week of June. We don't know how many of those were attributed to the heat, but that's 2,000 excess deaths in that period. All of this then transformed into a political debate. The French government, the government of Sébastien Lecornu, who's the Prime Minister of Emmanuel Macron, has been criticised for not doing enough. But political camps are kind of coalescing on this issue. So Marine Le Pen, notably, who is a hard right leader in France, the favourite to become the next president of France. So her party has traditionally been climato-skeptic, as they would call themselves. Now they're sort of saying climate change is a real thing and we need to deal with it. And the way we need to deal with it is by investing properly in air conditioning. Her opponent on the hard left is a guy called Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who he's taken the opposite position. He says climate change is a real thing, and it's going to become worse if people, especially in cities where lots of people are concentrated together, start using air conditioning a lot. And the people who would be affected most in cities would be the poorest people who cannot afford air conditioning, because all you're doing when you take put air conditioning into your building is you're taking heat from inside your building and you're shoving it outside the building. And for the first time, the leader of the Green Party in France is a woman called Marine Tondelier. She has started saying that the situation is so serious that air conditioning needs to be part of the solution, which is not something you would have expected just a few years ago. And it's been a kind of whole political ding-dong ever since then, really.
I wonder, Tristan, what do people in France then think of the US and how Americans are addicted to really cold indoor spaces in the summer?
So there was a headline that you read out earlier on, which I'd just like to just address. So it was an editorial that called Alternative Cooling Solutions, quote, green virtue signaling. So, I can't speak for all Europeans, but I don't know about that. I mean, I'm not sure that many Europeans are choosing to swelter in their houses just to prove a point to people in the United States. But it is fascinating to us over here in Europe that people in the United States are so interested in this question. Why do you think it is?
I'm in two minds and two hearts about this because I spent a decade and a half living in Berlin, which is pretty similar to what you described to Paris. There is no AC to be found anywhere. That is partly because in Germany, you also haven't seen the type of temperatures that Europe is experiencing now. In the past, you would have, as you said, maybe a week of really hot temperatures, and that was dealt with open windows. The Germans have something called Lüften and Stoßlüften, which is creating a cross breeze by opening several windows. And that's how you try to cool down a space, even if it's hot outside. Here in the US, and I grew up here and have come back here a few years ago, there is a sense that convenience is the most important thing. And why would you suffer in the heat when you can be cool inside? So I think part of what the concern is, I would say, about Europeans here is a bit of head scratching. That bewildering title, I think, describes it quite well. Why would you want to sit through unbearable heat and try to fall asleep with all your windows open in the summer and not be able to cool down when there is a solution there ready at hand? And actually, that perception also goes along with that virtue signaling. There are Americans, and I've talked to many of them, who say, well, the Europeans just think they're better than us, that they don't need air conditioning, and that they can be more green than we can here in the US. So I think it's kind of those two things together. I think one point Americans do make is when you have such extreme heat, and here in Washington, D.C., there are days where you simply could not function without air conditioning. But that would really reduce the productivity of society here, because in the summer, that means there are people who perhaps could not go to work. Maybe their kids could not go to school, so they would have to stay home.
That kind of conversation is being had in France as well. So Marine Le Pen says that it's an economic imperative to cool temperatures down for people in France. And, you know, if you listen to people on the endless radio debates that are raging on this topic right now, there will often be people who say, okay, yes, installing air conditioning in buildings which are very old and not meant to have air conditioning can be extortionately expensive. But what can be even more expensive is losing productivity in the economy. So we're just trying to make the best of a difficult situation over here because things have suddenly got a lot hotter than they used to be, and we're doing the best we can.
I think Americans would be very understanding of that.
Well, Sumi, in all of this, one of the questions is air conditioning actually a one-size-fits-all solution that works for everything? I wanted to know a little bit more about this, Sumi. So I got in touch with our colleague Graihagh Jackson, who's the host of the BBC podcast The Climate Question. And I wanted to start off by asking Graihagh if she actually had air conditioning herself. And she told me that she had a much more unusual solution to the problem.
I have a fan.
Yeah.
So I'm not entirely without means. If it gets really hot, I sleep under a wet sheet. That's my other technique.
Ooh.
But when I was pregnant and having to work, I was living in a 70s house that was really poorly insulated. So I used to sit with a big bucket of water under the desk with my feet in the bucket of water. And that was the best thing I could find to keep cool and do some work.
Does that work?
It works really, really well, yeah.
Our American listeners right now are going like, what are these people doing? They've got buckets of water under their desks. All right, well, Graihagh, it's so great to have you with us. Here at The Global Story, as you know, we look at stories where the world and America meet. And one of the things that has amazed some of the Americans on our team is that some of the Europeans on our team don't have air conditioning at home. And somehow this summer, it feels like air conditioning has become part of the conversation in a way that I don't really remember. Have you noticed more people buying air conditioning units in the UK?
Somewhat. I mean, people have mentioned it to me, but mostly I think because they're British, they just complain about how hot it is. And if they got aircon, then they wouldn't be able to complain about how hot it is. We love complaining about the weather here. Yeah. That sort of anecdotally, air conditioning units have been on the rise for a long time. I was looking at some data, 1990 to 2016 saw a fourfold increase in air conditioning units sold during that period. That's globally. So people
fourfold of not very much could also be not very much, or is it genuinely a lot now?
I mean, if you look at China, there are hundreds of millions of units installed. It's the same in the US, South Korea, Japan, are sort of third and fourth on the list. And then there are some emerging markets where maybe something like 27 million units are installed in places like India and Brazil. So there are still hundreds of millions of units. Granted, there are many more people than that, many people of which you would obviously never be able to afford air conditioning or might not even have access to electricity. So that kind of puts it into perspective. But that is expected to rise. That projection, if you like, of air conditioning sales is only going to go up and up. I have some data here that the UN says the need for aircon could triple by 2050.
I think probably deep down in the British psyche, there is the idea that succumbing to air conditioning is somehow shows weak moral fibre. But what are some, I mean, apart from the kind of sense of guilt that some British people or Europeans feel, what are the arguments against using air conditioning?
Well, it's expensive to install, right? I think that puts a lot of people off, especially when we're living in a cost of living crisis. Energy prices are soaring. So expensive to buy, expensive to run. But if you look at the environmental side, there are also some issues around the climate. So these air conditioning units use refrigerant gases, things like CFCs. And those, if they leak, are really, really potent planet warming gases, or if they're not disposed of at end of life, they're really problematic. There is quite a big push for those to be edged out or phased out and more climate friendly gases used instead. But the main bulk of emissions that come from air conditioners are actually how they're powered, the electricity they use. So that really depends on how the grid is powered and where you live in the world. So if you take 2 air conditioning units and you run one in China and one in Brazil, they will have totally different carbon footprints or climate footprints. So in China, that's because around 50% of the grid is powered with coal. So huge amount of fossil fuel energy, and coal is the dirtiest of the fossil fuels that we have. Brazil, on the other hand, 80% renewables on the grid. So the carbon footprint is far, far less. So it really depends on where you are in the world. So environment, cost, those are the sort of the main sort of cons, if you like. But there's a trade-off because people need to stay cool. People can't live in some of the conditions that they're experiencing. I mean, India in May was seeing temperatures sort of 40, 50 degrees. I mean, that's unlivable, really.
But in theory, it would be possible to have a carbon neutral air conditioning system in your house if all of the energy that you burnt in your house were renewable.
Yes. In theory, I mean, nearly zero. It depends on the refrigerant gases that we've talked about. But in theory, the UN has actually published a report last year at COP, the big climate conference, that said we could get to nearly zero emissions in the cooling sphere. So there's lots of solutions to be had. But it's also just not about how we power our grids and what gases we use. There are lots of solutions that help us bring down the amount of power and electricity we need. Because don't forget, if we install so much air conditioning, we're going to have to grow our grids exponentially to keep up with that power demand. I mean, maybe 20% more of the power that we're using today in 2050 just for cooling alone. And there's lots of other industries that are going to need renewable power, like cement and steel and the aviation industry, to produce sustainable fuels. So there's going to be much higher demand on the grid. So we need to reduce our energy consumption and make it much more energy efficient when we do need it.
Are air conditioning units as bad for the environment as some people would have us believe?
So it's hard to weigh in whether they're really bad or not, because like we've said, it depends on how your grid is being powered. It depends on how energy efficient your unit is, or even the standards in your country are very different depending on government laws and rules. So I think it's hard to say whether it's quote unquote good or bad, because I think it's also necessary for a lot of people. People cannot live at these sorts of temperatures, and indeed lots of people die in these sorts of temperatures.
What are some of the alternatives? I mean, you've suggested putting a tub of cold water under the desk. But for people who don't want to or cannot install air conditioning as we enter times of the year where it's just unbearably hot, what are some of the best tips and tricks?
Well, I want to zoom out a little bit, if that's okay, because I don't want the onus just to be on what individuals should or could do, because there's lots that town planners and governments can do. So I talked about before how the UN said we could get emissions down to nearly zero from cooling systems, and that is through energy efficiency, as I mentioned, but also how we build our cities. That's where the majority of us live. And there's also something called the urban heat island effect, which is where our cities are much, much hotter than the surrounding areas. And that's because we use lots of materials like concrete and asphalt, which are dark, so they absorb more sunlight. But because of the nature of the material, they also hold on to that heat much, much more. There's much less vegetation, which makes it much, much warmer. So cities are just much, much hotter as a result. So why don't we think about redesigning and rebuilding our cities, or when we're building new cities or extending them, how do we design cities in a way that are much more climatically comfortable? And one of the main solutions is green spaces. Lots of co-benefits, They keep our air cleaner, they make us happy as well, but they also keep us cooler because they provide shade, and all the plants do something called evapotranspiration, which is basically a fancy way of plants sweating, fancy way of saying that. So there's that sort of level of stuff, but also the buildings that we build. Think about a glass skyscraper in the middle of Dubai. That's going to require a lot of cooling because glass is not a very good material for thermal regulation. Conversely, in somewhere like the UK in winter, it also needs a lot of heating. So how do we build our buildings that are much more sort of thermally efficient? And we know how to do this. It's called passive cooling. It's where we use natural solutions to cool our homes. And we've been doing it for hundreds of years. So have you been to Morocco before?
Yes.
Tristan? So you've stood outside and then walked into a riad, those beautiful shaded courtyards, and I bet you notice the temperature difference. That is a way that you can design a building really cleverly so that it's cool. And again, that's water features, help cool the air, plants, and using shading. Thick walls as well help keep the heat out, and narrow windows. In Egypt, they use those sorts of techniques, but they also use something called a wind catcher, which is really, really beautiful. So on the tops of buildings, they have almost like a gazebo. They're beautiful. They're often beautiful wooden lattice work or brickwork, and it's got lots of holes. And so as the wind blows across the top of the city, the wind catchers are then caught in these little gazebos, and they get diverted. The air gets diverted down into the building. So it keeps ventilation, but it also keeps that cool air ventilating around the building and keeping the building cool. So there's lots of interesting ideas about how you can do this at low cost with materials that are widely available, that don't cost the moon to do. So that's sort of how you can think about it at top level. But there are lots of things that we can do. And I've gone out and done and seen lots of interesting things, including, would you believe it, painting windows with yogurt.
Go on.
Dairy or non-dairy, although there's probably a slightly lower carbon footprint to the non-dairy version. But basically, I met a guy called Tom who's been looking at low-cost solutions to stopping heat travelling through windows. And he found that with yogurt and a bit of a paint roller, he painted yogurt onto the window, and he then measured that yogurt film could reflect 80% of the sun's thermal energy, which meant that your room was much, much cooler as a result. I was really sceptical because I was like, smell, flies, whatever.
Yeah.
No flies, no smell, he says. And when it's the heatwave's over, you can just wash it off.
Say that, but we're not doing a very good job of convincing our American cousins that we are not insane.
That's true. I mean, something that I like to do, and I learnt this, I was doing a bit of reporting about the Little Ice Age, which was conversely a very cold time in England. It's where, have you ever seen pictures of the frost fairs on the River Thames where it freezes over?
Yes.
That period of time.
Yeah.
And this building called Hardwick Hall in the north of England was built then. It's a stunning piece of architecture. And what was really interesting about that is they had designed the building to be used based on the sun's position in the sky. So kitchen in the cold northern area, they have their breakfast where the sun rises and their dinner where the sun sets. So they literally followed the sun around the house.
Yes.
And I then went home and I moved my desk where I spend the majority of my day to follow the sun in winter and to hide from the sun in summer. And I can notice there's about a 2-degree temperature difference from moving from back and forth from my house. So you can do these like little weird quirky things if you can, if they're available to you. And all these little differences, they might not sound like much, but I think collectively they can add up.
We've been talking a little bit about France in this episode. And last week, Marine Tondelier, who's the leader of the French Green Party, who, the orthodox thinking would be that they would be against aircon. Now, Marine Tondelier acknowledged that it's now becoming necessary to have air conditioning as part of the solution. Do you think we're at a turning point in Europe?
Quite possibly. I mean, if you look back over the last couple of decades, one statistic I saw from the UN was something like 489,000 people have died as a result of heat-related deaths. I found that figure shocking. 489,000 people. That's nearly half a million people dying from heat every single year. That is every single year.
That's huge.
In I was so shocked to read that, and so actually it's very hard to put a cost of life against a cost to the environment. So there are always going to be trade-offs, at least in the short term. And maybe, the raising awareness of the fact that climate change is making heat waves more intense, more frequent. We've seen this one massive heat wave in June, and we're in the midst of the next one. So I wouldn't be surprised if aircon, at least in the UK and Europe, became a much more normal convention. But we'll have to wait and see.
Graihagh, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It's been great to have you.
It's been nice to be here.
That was Graihagh Jackson, host of the BBC podcast The Climate Question, which is also available here on YouTube. And that's it from us. The Global Story is also an audio pod. We're available every weekday on bbc.com or wherever you listen. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back again tomorrow. Cheerio.